Nathan, this is Sunil. I think you are the host, and so let me know when you'd like me to begin, if you have everybody, etc. Bryan, good to see you. Thank you for doing this.
Hey, Sunil, I'm admitting folks, I would wait 2 or 3 minutes after the start.
Can't hear you, Nathan. I think, are you muted?
I can hear him just fine. He said he wanted to wait 2 or 3 minutes for folks to come in. Sunil, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'll chat him.
Okay.
Sorry, the problem was on my end. I can hear everyone now. Apologies.
Right. Yeah, I was just saying I would wait a couple of minutes. I see people are still pouring into the meeting, so I would wait 2 or 3 more minutes.
Great.
Thank you.
So a question I often have is what kind of music would be best played for an academic event while people are waiting for it to start? And I think it really depends on the institution and also on who's going to be speaking. But sometimes I like to ask the crowd too what they would like to hear.
Given that it's a futurist speaking, probably Richard Strauss and Thus Spake Zarathustra from 2001 Space.
Very, very nice. Very nice. Or depending on my topic, some of the other music from that movie, such as the Getty's Atmospheres, just to say. The chat box has just gone nuts with this. I'm a big fan of Deborah Buffalin, who just recommended playing Alice Cooper as School's Out. Very nice. Very nice. Donita Washington suggested Johnny Mathis. So we're just kind of all over. Oh, but Mike Reese wants us to do German electronica. Very, very nice. Maybe I could play some Can. Yeah, that'd be good. Naira wants Kraftwerk. I'm with it. This is good. My own preference might be for some some pretty solid death metal first thing in the morning, just to get people going. I could do the voice, but we'll see. We'll see. Dion outclasses us all by recommending Chopin. Very, very nice. Very good. That would do it.
All right. It looks like we have about 100 in here, so I think we can get started whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I'll get started in a second. It's that was quite a warm-up act, Brian. The music thing, I got everybody thinking. So now my job as a good bureaucrat is to put them back to sleep. So let me do that. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today. And I've been welcoming people to the Delta Symposiums. This is something that we created, I think, 3 years ago, and trying to drive the campus towards doing more innovative things with teaching technology and digital education. And there are very few things you can think of as a positive coming out of COVID. In fact, the list is minuscule, but this is one of them. I'm not a fan of the word disruption. I think it's overused. And even though, I knew Clayton Christensen, I still felt that his concept had been turned into a cliche. But there is no doubting that COVID is a disruptor. And it's a disruptor in both good and bad ways, just as all disruptors are. And in particular, it will change the use of technology in education for Hopkins, for all our peers, and it will change it in ways that are lasting. So it's rare for a bureaucrat like me to just accept that somehow we will be changed permanently, but I cannot see how this will not change us permanently. And in order to do that, we cannot just rely on, well, let's do exactly what was done in a classroom that, if you go to the University of Bologna, which dates back, I think, to the 13th century, there is a classroom to teach surgery there where there's a dissection table in the middle of the room, and there's a platform where the lecturer can stand and lecture, and another platform where the inquisitor can stand there and make sure that the lecturer doesn't say anything that the Inquisition didn't agree with. And we can't just say, we'll do the exact same thing except put this on Zoom, right? As if between the 13th century and now, we've done no change in the message. We've simply changed the medium. And that cannot possibly be the right way, especially given the scale at which we have gone online this semester and the length of time we may have to operate at least partially in that mode, given that not all our students will be able to even make it to campus. So given this, I think Delta becomes particularly important. I think figuring out how to do things for disciplines that have resisted this. I'm particularly interested, for example, in the anatomy project, as well as for how to make the lecture itself much more engaging, given that online, there's evidence that people do not behave exactly as they would in the classroom. And so there's more motivation to have projects like Delta to get the people who want to innovate the support they need to do so. So I'm delighted to announce the 2020 Delta grants for next year. We will continue to support at the same level as we did last time. And the call for proposals, I think, is either out or will be out soon and will be due at the end of the month. And I'm hoping to see the same kind of response as we saw last time, where we got 45 odd proposals from across the university, and of people trying very interesting ideas on everything from teaching at scale to teaching concepts or modalities that are not that amenable, at least prima facie, to technological intervention. So all of this, I think, bodes well for the next year. I hope that we get a fair bit of innovation. And for my part, I will try to see that the innovation sticks, because what we learned during the crisis, we should not forget. To use another cliche attributed to Churchill, we should not let any crisis go to waste. And we should use this time to learn how to improve teaching through the use of technology. Every other sector of our life has been, improved or at least changed by technology, and we can no longer resist, nor should we, that it should not change our fundamental educational mission. So, with that kind of statement of recommitment to both Delta as well as what not only the recipients but the other people on this call have shown interest in, I'd like to turn to introducing our speaker today. And I think after his keynote, there will be another, in the closing session, he will also participate in a kind of free-form Q&A with Stephen Ganji, who's my Executive Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. And so I think it would be great if you also thought through questions that you can tee up for the closing session. So Bryan Alexander is an internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher. And his field is, of course, how technology transforms education. He's currently a scholar at Georgetown, teaches graduate seminars in their Learning, Design, and Technology program. And he's previously worked with the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education, a nonprofit helping small colleges and universities integrate digital technologies. And so I can only imagine that given COVID, how colleges like, say, the wonderful St. John's College we have in Annapolis, which is lost in my mind of the truly liberal arts educations, where you're not even allowed to major. Everybody studies everything. How they must be, rapidly striving to adapt their curriculum for remote education. And so I'm glad that he has helped in that sector, and he has an interesting background, having gotten a PhD in English language and literature from Michigan, and having taught at the Centenary College of Louisiana as well. So, and as you saw from his warm-up for this event, a person with wide musical taste, not all of which I share or appreciate, but that's neither here nor there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bryan Alexander. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sunil, for that really kind introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? Excellent, excellent. I really appreciate the chance to get to talk with you all this morning and to learn from you all today. I appreciate this for a few reasons. One is that Johns Hopkins is, of course, the foundational research university for the United States. It's also a world leader in the struggle against the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, there's this press that's part of it, a university press, which was kind enough to publish my most recent book and to take me on for my next. So my hat's off to Johns Hopkins University Press for doing great work. I'm a futurist. I specialize in the future of higher education. So today, you will be unsurprised to know that that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. My goal is to get you thinking about where the next years of higher education could go. I'd really like to be able to give you some inspiration, some thoughts. But a key thing is, I'd like to start off by getting you to think about what it means to be a futurist. So to start off with, can you all see these slides here?
They're really small. Is there any way to make them bigger?
Yeah. Hang on 1 second. This is this case of the love affair between Mac and PC. And by love affair, I mean...
Presentation mode, not in show mode.
No, it's in show. It's in show. Mm-hmm.
PowerPoint wasn't suited for the future.
Well, apparently not.
There you go. Looks good.
Very good. Well, I mentioned Johns Hopkins University Press was kind enough to publish my most recent book, Academia Next. And I'm going to be speaking today from some of the themes there. The book came out in January of this year, and it covers a wide range of ground. But ever since February, some readers have been working through the first chapter. And the first chapter concerns thinking about the future of education, giving people examples of ways to consider that colleges and universities could be different. And they come to a certain page. They come to page 23, and then they freak out. Because on page 23, I asked people to imagine what would happen to higher education after a major pandemic strikes the world. I was inspired by the 1918 Great Influenza, and then I go through this page and describe different ways that we could be thinking about such an event and what that could do to colleges and universities, how that could change research, distance learning, what happens to conferences, what happens to athletics. Every so often, futurists get things right. I'm sorry that this is one that I got right. There are many other positive things that we can talk about, but this is one. If you'd like to look at the book, the entire book is online for free from Project Muse. So you can go page through the entirety of it. There's a link there, muse.jhu.edu/book/72236. Or you just search it for Academia Next. My hat's off to Project Muse for posting all of that, and my thanks to Johns Hopkins University Press for letting them do it. So what I'm going to be talking about over the next roughly 45 minutes is a series of trends. And we take a look at trends because this is one good way to look at the future. You study forces in the present, forces that you can analyze and document, that you can get solid evidence for, and imagine what would happen if those extrapolate into the future and what kind of world they could create. So to begin with, I'd like to talk about some of the, what I call education and contexts. So these are forces within education, such as enrollment or finance, as well as pressures from the outside world, be they macroeconomics, demographics, or policy. Then we're going to shift ground and talk about education and technology. So how the technology world intersects with higher education. After that, I'd like to speak a bit about COVID-19. So to begin with, I'd like to start the biggest picture possible. One of the amazing trends that we've experienced over the past generation has been the increasing globalization of higher education. And when you hear the term globalization in America, it usually cuts a few ways. But here I'm being very precise. What I mean is the expansion of a market in higher education for study, as well as the increased expansion of international and transnational research. And we've seen this around the world. We've seen all kinds of aspects of this, from American campuses opening branch campuses abroad to multiple institutions in other nations trying to bulk up their higher education capacity, to collaboration across international borders. I mean, it's a really, really elaborate world, and it grew very, very strongly worldwide until about 2 months ago. Now, one aspect of this is increasing competition in research. And we've seen recently that China has increased its scholarly output in just enormous, enormous levels. And they are, at least by one count, very, very close to a second place to the United States right now. So it's interesting to see how the research university continues to have geopolitical dimensions. Now, I mentioned, of course, that this grew until February, and obviously COVID-19 has had a problem with that. And we'll circle back to that at the end. But a key theme here about all this transnational higher education is that in every continent of the world, there is a sensibility that we must increase the total number of students that go through higher education. And be it because there's industrial training in the developing world, or the sense of post-industrial economies and the knowledge economy and the service economy in the developed world. In other words, there's this drive to increase quantity throughput through higher education. Also, there's a drive to increase the quality of higher education, that the sense that instruction needs to be improved. And this varies from nation to nation. I mean, you'll get some nations that say that what they want to do is basically model the U.S. version. In some cases, they want to improve K through 12 and use that to build their post-secondary education experience. The key point here is this dual demand for increased quantity and quality worldwide. And we'll see the U.S. also shares this. Now, a second major trend to keep in mind is the transformation of population. And there are a couple of forces that are really, really significant. One is urbanization, that we've been witnessing for the past century, the gradual shift of the human race from country into city. But the one I want to really draw your attention to here is the transformation of age. And one of the things that we know from every society in the world is that when a society goes through modernity, when they go through a combination of increasing science, increasing public health, especially increasing education for women, we know that two things happen. First, we know that women have fewer and fewer children. The second, we know that the population lives longer and longer. So one of the side effects of this is a complete transformation of human society. Let me explain with a visual. This is a chart of what human history looked like until about 1900. And this is what a lot of the developing world looks like. It's a population chart. Every horizontal slice is a population aspect by age. And you can see, if you look at the very, very bottom, that we tend to produce an awful lot of babies. And then mortality sets in year by year. So we have a lot of babies, fewer teenagers, fewer young adults, fewer middle-aged people, fewer still senior citizens. And that's what the world looked like until modernity. And now this is what the world looks like once you've gone through that process. That pyramid gets flipped upside down because you have more seniors than adults, more adults than teenagers, and more adults than kids. And this pattern occurs in society after society. I mean, it's really fascinating. And for those of you who remember the 1970s, this is kind of the opposite of what we were led to expect. This is the opposite of the population boom. In fact, at some point over the next generation, we should be expecting a total population plateau worldwide. And then following that, a shrinkage. And you can see this pattern in Germany. You can see it in South Korea, Mexico, Italy. I mean, it's an incredibly intense thing. In the U.S., it's a little different because up until a few years ago, we had a lot of immigration, and immigration tends to bring in younger populations. So you can see here from the census estimate, around 1960, we looked pretty much like the usual pyramid, and anticipating by 2060 something like a refrigerator or a rectangle. But that's based on strong immigration flows. Obviously, we're not experiencing that now. Why does this matter for education? A few reasons. First, it means that the K through 12 pipeline is narrowing. So to the extent that a university supports traditional age undergraduates, 18 to 22 years old, it means that there are going to be fewer and fewer of them, which means competition for them is going to heat up and become fierce. That's interesting. A second is that as our population continues to age out, it means that we have a greater opportunity for teaching more and more adults and more seniors. So it may be that the median age of students begins to sweep upwards, and it may be that we develop new curricula and new pedagogies for teaching senior citizens. You can come back to that if you like. This is a huge, huge point. And by the way, this is distributed unevenly globally. So, for example, this is one map. If you look at the countries that are blue, those are the ones that are still producing children at scale. So if you want to understand the demographic surges of the 21st century, don't look at China, don't look at Europe or the US. Look instead at sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East. And if your college or university is still interested in serving 18-year-olds, those might be the regions where you want to explore. Now, in the U.S., the demographics are also very uneven. This is here based on the work of Nathan Graw, who does fantastic work on the demographics of higher education. And you can see that in the Northeast and the Southeast, the states that are in red, orange, or yellow are the ones that are producing fewer and fewer kids. If you also overlay onto that in your mind the sense that the Northeast and the Midwest are where we have the bulk of American higher education, you could see there's some interesting challenges ahead. Now, another population shift that we have to keep in mind, and that's pretty well known, but I do want to stop and address it for a second, is that our student population has shifted. There's still this kind of cliche that the typical college student is an 18-year-old who goes away to a residential college for their undergraduate experience. They graduate in 4 years. This is largely a myth. And then afterwards, they donate lavishly to their alma mater. It's a good story, and we do have students like that. But instead, the typical undergraduate has changed. More and more of them are adults, and that may change this fall as well. More and more of them are non-white, especially Latino. There's a growing number of first-generation college students. I mean, after all, we have this desire, remember, to increase the quantity of students going through higher education. Well, we've kind of maxed out of the students whose parents, one or more, have had some college experience. We have more and more veterans as students because the United States is coming up on our 20th year of war. And on top of that, we have a rising number of students with learning disabilities. If you put all these together, we have a very, very diverse, rich, and fascinating population, but also one that is in some ways more challenging and perhaps more expensive to teach. Now, it's also, as I mentioned, a population that is increasingly non-white, and we really, really see that in different states of the U.S., especially the West Coast. But the white population continues to shrink. The Asian American and Latino populations continue to rise. And again, we have that demand to improve quantity. We still have the desire to get as many students through as much post-secondary education as possible, and we do want to improve the quality. But let me continue about this and dive into a few more details. And again, think of these as the contexts around which your work moves. From about 1980 to about 2012, we lived through an extraordinary boom in higher education enrollment in the United States. It doesn't have a name as far as I can tell, but it's truly vast, and it's worth pairing with, say, the growth in enrollment following the GI Bill, or the huge growth in enrollment following the 19th century birth of land-grant institutions. I mean, it's truly vast. And we've lived through this, and it's something to be very proud of. It's transformed higher education in all kinds of ways, up until about 2012, at which point that boom stopped cold, and we've gone down every semester since. The total enrollment in American higher education is down about 8 percentage points since 2012. You can see here from this chart from the National Student Clearinghouse that most of that decline has been based in the community college world and in the for-profit world, where the for-profit industry was massively quashed during the second term of the Obama administration. Community colleges suffered in many ways by years of low unemployment, but the rest of higher education hasn't been growing very much. So to the extent that higher education depends on enrollment, we may be in trouble. Now, the characteristics of that enrollment are also different. It's kind of a cliche to think about the sense that we have a feeling of needing more STEM, needing more health, and that the humanities aren't doing well. But it's a cliche based in reality. This is some work from the American Historians Association. If you look at the top right of this, you take a look at the fields that are booming in terms of degrees awarded. You can see in many ways there are no surprises there. Exercise science, computer science, nursing, health and medical, environment and conservation, math, physics. I mean, it's in many ways very, very typical that we are growing STEM and economics. If you look at the very bottom left of this chart, you can see that we are not growing the humanities. In fact, those are shrinking rapidly. If you take a look at history, religion, area studies, those are shrinking by a third. This is a huge pattern, and this has implications for all kinds of things, including curricula, including program development, including which faculty we hire and which we don't, as well as public education in the United States. I need to move on and address one more aspect of our population. Who works in higher education has also changed. So another stereotype is that of the professor who is, say an older man who has a tweed jacket and all of that and is tenured. You often find most discussions of higher education focused on tenure track faculty as kind of the rock of higher ed. Well, if you look at this graph, we've actually changed that picture up quite a bit. If you look at who we've been hiring since the 1970s, you'll see the biggest sector of all is non-faculty. It's staff. It's administrators, everything from deans to librarians to technologists to custodians to grants officers and compliance officers. That's the huge boom in our hiring, almost 400% since the 1970s. And then if you look next to that, you see the next boom area is part-time adjunct faculty. I mean, one of the things that's happened in our lifetime is we've switched from the American Professoriate being a majority tenured track to the American Professoriate being majority temps. And if you look in the very right edge of this graph, you can see a little unicorn. That's the amount that we've increased adjunct faculty. Now, this is uneven, depends on where you are geographically, institutionally, but generally speaking, the higher education workforce is now at least parity, if not majority, administrative. And when it comes to faculty, mostly temporary faculty. Now, another context I want you to bear in mind is the huge transformation in income and wealth inequality. This is something that we've lived through and really didn't remark upon until 2008. And even then, it's still kind of tricky to bear in mind. So let me just give you a quick graphic. This is based on the work of economists like Emmanuel Saiz and Thomas Piketty, and looks at income inequality in 4 English-speaking countries, including the US. The vertical axis is inequality. The higher, the more unequal. And the horizontal axis is time. So if you look at this chart, if you look at the left side of it, you can see that a little more than 100 years ago, we were pretty good at income inequality. You know, it's coming off of the Gilded Age, right? And then from about World War I through World War II, we blew that up. Income inequality fell drastically. So that from about 1945 to about 1980, we were the least economically unequal we'd ever been. And just look at that trough for a minute. It's fascinating. If you think about American population, if you think about American popular culture, if you think about, for example, the baby boom experience, if you think about policies like the Great Society, but also in that trough, in that compressed spot, is where we overhauled higher education. That was when we decided to have a Department of Education at the federal level. That's when we decided that everybody had to have post-secondary experience. That's when we grew the community college system, where we turned teachers' colleges into baccalaureates into masters into PhD programs. I mean, that's when we overhauled higher education. If you want to understand why universities are having a hard time in the 21st century, this is one reason. They were built for the 1960s. And things have moved on. Look at the right edge of that graph. That's how things have moved on, starting in the early 1980s for a variety of reasons, including globalization, including financialization, and perhaps including technology. We've revved up the inequality engine, and it's shot up across all presidential terms, across economic crises. We are now in what a Swiss bank calls Gilded Age 2.0. And so if you think about it, think about the world we're preparing our students for. If you think about how we proceed with funding, and of course, Johns Hopkins, you have a good example of the latter with a wonderful gift from one of today's Vanderbilts and Carnegies, from Michael Bloomberg. Now, what does this mean for actually students and how they pay for higher education? Well, the U.S. has invented a new thing. We've invented the financialization of higher education. That is, we cut student support on a per student basis from state governments, from public universities and colleges. We've increased tuition for a variety of reasons I'm happy to talk about. And the way we supported all of this was by exploding student debt. And the amount now, estimates vary between $1.6 and $1.7 trillion. It's the largest amount of debt in the United States. It's bigger than credit card debt. It's second only to mortgages in terms of total debt. And we're trying to catch up with that. And most of the debt is held by women across the board. So why am I telling you all of this? We're here to talk about teaching. We're here to talk about technology and teaching. Why am I giving you all these other trends? Because that's the context in which we proceed. It's too easy that when we think about technology, that we zero in on a given technology and that we don't think about the context it inhabits. We don't think about the forces that change it. We don't think about the powers around it. We don't think about the contexts that shape our decisions and our choices and what we have available. I want to make sure you have that. These trends are pretty scary, a lot of them. That's why I call them crunch time. I want you to think about these enormous pressures on higher education, reforming, squeezing, and redesigning colleges and universities across the country. All of these precede COVID-19. All of these precede technology. So let's dive into technology a little bit. And just one thing for you in the chat box, and also for your own question answer, what I'd love for you to do is to think about which of these trends strike you as the most salient for your own work and your own institution. Which of these do you think are most likely to have the biggest effect? I don't mean necessarily which of these you find the most delightful, but just the ones most likely to have an impact. So let's talk about technology. We could talk about technology for weeks. Computer scientists involved in this conversation know that. And we can cover a wide range of fields. But in the interest of time and your attention, I want to zoom in on a few aspects of technology in higher education. And to do this, it's important to think about there's an awful lot of digital engagement in American higher education. Yes, we tend to be slower than parts of the US in grappling with digital technology, but we have an enormous investment. We have a lot of people, we have a lot of technology, a lot of practices, even before our great migration to online for COVID-19. So let me just pull out a few of the, I think, some of the more interesting and having an impact fields that are coming up over the next generation. To begin with, we have finally caught on to Moneyball. We have finally figured out in higher education that students generate an awful lot of data, and we can gather that data and use that data to help. We can help attract students, we can help shape their experience, we can help them succeed as undergraduates and grad students, and we can use it to help shape how they interact with us after they graduate. So right now there's a huge demand for data gathering, data harvesting, data analysis, and ways to make that actionable. And this plays out across a wide range of areas. Now, it's not a universally happy picture because at the same time, we're also very nervous about data collection and data analysis worldwide. This is a cover of a book which has, from my mind, the second best title of a book published in the 21st century. Kathy Neal's Weapons of Math Destruction will take you through the many ways that we can use data badly. We can use it to reinforce, reinscribe, or even enhance prejudice. People can use it to accrete power. And there's the question of who controls the data. For example, when you hear the expression data is the new oil, you might think about what that means for petrostates. It's a sign of power. There's a Lancet article from about a year and a half ago, which I really like, which had the alternative framing that we should think of data as the new blood. That data is something that we should store and use very, very carefully with a great deal of prudence. Now, another key aspect that is not exactly new, but we're still addressing and still working on is the question of mobility, because we have, in many ways, such a huge change in our basic computing paradigms. The majority of the world accesses digital data the most of the time through mobile devices, especially through phones, be they smartphones or feature phones. But in higher education, we still tend to assume desktop and laptop computing. So we need to get better at that. And there's been a steady push across the country for IT departments to be mobile first. It does take a lot of work. It takes a lot of support. It takes a lot of transformation from software providers as well. One way we might think about mobile computing is what I think of as ambient or ubiquitous computing. That is devices that are very small and can be woven into daily life. So don't think about the giant monitor on your desk with a big tabletop computer. Think instead about the little computer on your wrist, on your finger, in your shoes, in your clothing, in your car, or just sitting on the wall. There are a lot of ways to use such ambient computing. Indeed, we can refer to this as the Internet of Things. Now, another aspect of technology in education has been the rise of what some call blended or flipped or the hybrid classroom. In many ways, I think we're going to stop talking about this pretty soon because, first of all, it's hard not to do this. That is, if you want to exclude technology from your classroom, it's very difficult. You'd have to figure out a way to basically, strain all devices from the students, and that's not easy. You have to remove all devices from the classroom, like projectors and so on. That's not easy. And then you're still bathing in at least Wi-Fi, if not cell phone connectivity. So you need to enclose your classroom in a Faraday cage. And the minute the students leave, they're back in all of it again. So I think the idea that we use the face-to-face classroom or the synchronous classroom for what it does best discussion, for example, and that we use the asynchronous classroom for what it does best, presentations, is something that just continues to grow. Now, one thing that has stopped growing that is very interesting is how students interact with our materials online. Do they interact with us through the open web, or do they experience our classes through silos? That is, do we use a learning management system, which is more or less an asocial tool, to corral our student content and learning, or do we unleash them on the open web? There's been a lot of debate over that for about 20 plus years, but it's changed recently. There's been rising concern that students in the open web will be susceptible to abuse or trolling or unethical data gathering. So it's possible we'll see a powerful tendency to keep students safe from all of that. Now, one more technology that's blindingly obvious, but we've got to mention is video. Because video is one of those technologies that appeals apparently to just about every demographic. You think about older folks who've grown up with television and movies. You think about younger folks who've grown up with the ability to shoot films from their phones. Video is just increasingly used. I mean, by video, I mean everything from video conferencing like we're doing right now. And my thanks to our hosts for making this available so ably. But also think about people producing video content for learning, students making video. And of course, consuming video, everything from the giant bandwidth hog that is Netflix to YouTube. And beyond this, just if you haven't seen this, go back to YouTube and look for something called the mother of all demos. It takes you back to the late 1960s. And there's an extraordinary moment where the great criminally underappreciated inventor, Doug Engelbart, introduces people to the Windows and mouse interface. It's an amazing, amazing demo because what he does is he moves a mouse around and clicks on it, and you can see windows change. And you can hear the audience freaking out as he does this, just saying, why? How can that be? Oh my God, how does that work? I mentioned this in part because the demo doesn't always work, and Engelbart is incredibly cool doing it, so that's good to know. But also, that's been the computing paradigm that's dominated us ever since. I'm using a Windows-based laptop right now. Perhaps many of you are experiencing this presentation that way as well. We may be changing that up in a big way because we have the advent of two different technologies. We have virtual reality, which is the digital recreation of an immersive world through different screens. And we have augmented reality, which is adding the digital world to the physical world. Well, if we combine these, we come up with what's called augmented or mixed reality. And you can see this with tools like HoloLens. And that can really change things in some interesting ways. What you see here is a screenshot from a project from Worcester Polytech where a professor built a protein molecule visualization that he experiences by looking at it through headpiece, and he controls it with his voice and through gestures. He's able to flip and toggle through multiple visualization designs for this molecule. He can zoom in, zoom out, spin, focus. And this is from 4 years ago. Imagine how that changes how we interact with technology. There's no keyboard here, no window interface. It's a very, very different paradigm. Another longer running paradigm is the push towards open, and that is open education resources for teaching and learning, open access and scholarly publication, open source software for courseware, and open teaching. That is people who share their teaching beyond the metaphorical closed door of the classroom and share it via podcast, Twitter, and so on. So we're seeing the open movement continue to progress. Now I want to skip a couple of, I don't want to skip this one. We've been talking about many, many emerging technologies. I just want to quickly touch on blockchain just for a minute. One of the uses of blockchain in higher education is as certification for credentials. Blockchain offers a few different interesting advantages to that. One is permanence, if institutions transform or end, and also some degree of user control. Another technology to draw your attention to is the completely fascinating and at times underwhelming 3D printing. 3D printers are somewhere right now halfway between the 2D printer of the Xerox machine and the Star Trek replicator. They're fascinating at all kinds of levels, and they also enable the pedagogy of the makerspace. One of the things I love about all these technologies is they make us think about students as makers, students as producers. And pedagogically, it's very interesting to think about students as makers of stuff. And we've always made stuff as students. We've always made, tests, performances, and papers, but never with such power, never with such media heft, and never with such permanence. So it's really interesting to rethink what happens to pedagogy if students are actually makers. If we consider them as intellectual property holders, how do we celebrate that? How do we support that? How do we share that? What does that add to their ability to teach and learn? Okay, all of these are trends in the present day. All of these are questions and topics that are in evidence, nothing speculative about them. So let's push them forward a bit. What might happen if all these come true, or some of them do? In my book, I have a stack of scenarios, little stories about how our education could change. Let me just touch on a couple of these. One is the idea of what I call peak higher education. And this is the idea that higher education passed the peak and we are continuing to shrink ever since. You have to imagine a future where we have fewer students, fewer faculty, fewer staff, fewer colleges and universities. The entire sector is worth less money. Some have called this euphemistically right-sizing or downsizing, but this is one possibility that we seem to be heading towards. Another possibility is what I call healthcare nation. And that's because, first, in the United States, we have the demographic transformation I was talking about. And we know statistically, the older we get, the more healthcare we consume. But also the U.S. has this unusual system for financing healthcare, which is, among other things, very inefficient, very expensive. So imagine what happens if healthcare becomes a dominant sector of our economy, our biggest industry. How does that change education? What happens if healthcare increases and becomes more and more important? What happens if more and more schools become medical schools or pre-medical schools or schools associated with medicine in different ways? Another possible future is that of what I call the triumph of open. So if the majority of scholarship is available in open access format, if the majority of educational research is available in open education materials, how does that change education? I mean, you think in many ways of some boons, like lowering of costs for monographs and articles and textbooks and textbook material. And you can think of the creativity boom that comes along with that as well. But also you think about some costs, the possibility of lower quality, the possibility of businesses going out of business. It's a tricky world to think about. Another is to imagine what I call the augmented campus. That is, if we assume a mixed reality campus, walking across a university and being able to look across it and see data. So being able to see what books are available in the library, which faculty members are available in which buildings, to scroll back through time and get a sense of what the campus looked like 10, 20, 100 years ago, to be able to have virtual reality conversations with students as you're walking across a quad or down the hallway of a classroom. It's a really interesting transformed campus in that way. Now, we can also imagine what I think of as the retro campus. And this is a campus where people decide that we've gone way too far with all the technology stuff. And that what we should do is we should go back to the pre-web days of, say, 1990. So you imagine a campus where faculty, staff, and students leave their devices at the door, where there are Faraday cages, where the emphasis is on handicrafts and physical writing and physical materials. I've mentioned this scenario and some of the people laugh and they think it's satirical. It can be, but it also has some appeal to certain people. Another thing to think about is what some call the higher education bubble. I share this cover of from Consumer Reports because Consumer Reports is by design the least imaginative publication in American history. It's one that has no hype and it's very straight up. And this is how they decided to begin their one issue. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I mentioned that we want to improve the quality of higher education. There's anxieties about that. I wanted to draw your attention to the cost problem because while published tuition rises, the real tuition is lower. Most people look at the published tuition. Anxiety is about debt, anxiety is about employment. Some graduate school fields have been really suffering, especially law and now MBAs. And it's interesting that there's bipartisan political pressure to reform higher education. Indeed, some campuses across the country have been conducting what I call the Queen's Sacrifice. This is when they decide to lay off tenured and tenure-track faculty. If you don't know, in chess, there's a move you can do where you can sacrifice your most powerful piece, the queen, in a desperate gambit to win the game. Well, in many ways, the tenure-track faculty member is the queen on the chessboard of higher education. They're the ones with some governance. They have tenure protections and permanence. Giving up tenured faculty is a tricky thing to do. But there are a lot of ways of doing it, including financial exigency being declared or ending programs. I've been tracking campuses doing this across the country, and believe me, we will see more of that as COVID-19 continues to hit us. Now, wild card in all this is what happens to automation, that is robotics and AI. This photo, by the way, is a drone with a chainsaw. I have no justification whatsoever for showing this photo except that it's a drone with a chainsaw. And if you appreciate that, good. If you don't, I can't help you. The reason I'm mentioning this is because there are a lot of ways that AI can impact, and automation can impact higher education. You can think about ways of replacing classes and instructors with mobile apps. This is something that may appeal to campuses where they are suffering financially, or for classes that are marginal, less commonly taught languages, for example. We can also think about computer-assisted creativity, that is using computers to improve our ability to make art. We already have this, computer programs that assist us in taking photos and making photos, of creating sketches, of making music and video. There are a lot of ways that can be done. And we can also think about computer-assisted teaching and learning. So, for example, teaching a political science class to be able to trawl student data, to be able to give feedback to students, to use predictive analytics to get a sense of how the students could do, but also to use, if I'm teaching, say, a class on elections or comparative politics, to have an AI run across data and teach students how to use AIs to analyze big data sets. Top of this, we have to think about the possibility of underemployment. I don't mean because of COVID-19, but what happens if technology leads to widespread underemployment or unemployment? We have to think how that changes our curriculum in terms of, well, what should we teach that can't be modified, that can't be automated? And then we have to think about perhaps higher education as a source for helping us think about what it means to be human when our inventions exceed us. And we already know that self-driving cars are in many ways less dangerous than human drivers are. We already have programs that exceed humans at everything from playing chess and Go to speech transcription. Perhaps fields as diverse as philosophy, media studies, sociology, and computer science can help us think this through. Now, I wanted to touch on COVID-19, and then I would really like to hear your thoughts and your questions. Obviously, the pandemic has had an enormous impact on higher education. I was part of a project that ran for a month and a half where we tracked how colleges and universities closed and shifted their teaching online, which is truly stupendous, an enormous migration. Yes, enormously difficult and stressful and painful, but really extraordinary, and I believe unprecedented in American academic history. And now we're looking carefully at what happens in the future. Well, a few thoughts about that. People have thought that this was a giant black swan, that no one anticipated it. This is the Trump administration's policy. This is quite false. People in futurist fields, people in epidemiology, public health have been gaming and simulating pandemics for a long time. I'm not the only one who has called this. But I do imagine three possible ways this could play out in the fall semester as well as the spring. First, it's possible we will see campuses open up to face-to-face instruction again. There are all kinds of ways they can do this, and all kinds of reasons. One of the big reasons is the idea that in the United States, at least, that we may hit a plateau this month and then go downhill and see infections and deaths drop over the next couple of months, so that come fall, COVID-19 is about as dangerous as a seasonal flu. I mean, something you take shots for, you take precautions for, but nothing worth closing campuses for. And there are all kinds of ways to open campuses and all kinds of problems in how that can be done. I mean, you think about how do you convince faculty, staff, and students to return to a campus at risk of infection, but that's one possible mode. And you've seen some campuses make noises about doing this, including Brown University and including Purdue. A second is the possibility that fall may look like March and April, that we may just continue. It depends on how the pandemic plays out, but if the pandemic is still roaring through society and we perceive it as such, we may just do the entire fall semester online, in which case we may see a serious drop in higher education. That is, we may see enrollment tick down. We've already gotten signals that some undergraduates and some grad students would prefer not to attend a wholly online fall semester, especially if it's their first one. We may also see students demanding tuition breaks. Not just students, but for traditional age students, their parents, state governments, national politicians, nonprofits, and companies, because of their perception that online learning is inferior to face-to-face. And a third one is what I've called the toggle term, and that is a semester where we alternate between face-to-face and online education based on how the pandemic plays out. So, for example, imagine that in August and September, the semester starts and the pandemic is relatively quiescent, and we open face-to-face and we have fraternities and games and so on. But then in October, the pandemic comes roaring back. And we decide, all right, we need to take steps. So we quarantine individuals and then maybe send everybody back home. The key thing here is that the campus has to be ready to do both face-to-face and online and to switch back and forth depending on safety needs. Now, I want to pause here. I've hurled a ton of scenarios at you. I've given you a lot to think about, a lot of different trends. So what I'd like to ask for you is I'd like to ask for your thoughts and your questions. I'm happy to go back and expand upon any point here. There's a lot that I've just thrown at you in a hurry, but I really want to hear your thoughts, both on how you think these forces will shape higher education, which of these scenarios you think is most likely, and also how you think they'd impact you if you're a faculty member, staff member, state government member, or student. So let me just stop scaring my screen for a minute here, and let's head to some discussion. I can, while people are thinking about this, I'd like to take a look here at the chat box and see what questions have already come up. Someone asked my favorite title of the book published in the 21st century. It's a history of the Soviet space program called The Red Rocket's Glare. I think that's an awesome title, but not everyone likes it, but there it is. And let's see, we have no other questions right here, right now. So let me hear from you. Which of these trends do you think is most likely to hit us? Please use the chat box to type in, or let us know if you'd like to join us on stage. And I'd love to hear from your voices. I said that and the chat box just exploded. Todd Norman says, I didn't mention the anti-science movement. It's quite true. The anti-science movement is very, very interesting in all kinds of ways. And looking ahead, my fear is that the longer the pandemic drags on, the longer that measures extend, the more the anti-science movement will grow. And by anti-science, I'm not sure how Todd is thinking, but this is how I'm thinking of it. Multiple pieces of it. One is long tradition in the United States of skepticism about science dating back to really the 19th century and evolution. So sometimes that's religiously based. Sometimes it's based on scam health products. Sometimes it's based on cultural critique, but that you'll see that in folks in the right wing like Alex Jones or even President Trump. And there's a liberal version of this, which is often in the New Age movement. You can see traces of it in the science studies academically, and perhaps most notoriously or most glamorously, you can see it in Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop. But there's a lot of skepticism about science, and I think right now that does empower in part skepticism about expertise, including higher education. Allison Papadakis asks about students' consumerist mindset and how that might affect responses to COVID. That's a great question, Allison. I think one response I mentioned already is that if students are taking classes online and they perceive that experience to be inferior, I think this is going to elicit more and more demands for tuition breaks. I mean, we've already seen fee breaks, for campus-based events, but to reduce tuition, I've seen everything from threats of strikes to petitions to lawsuits, and that's not crazy. I mean, if they make the argument that online education is lesser, then on a consumerist mindset, it makes sense to pay less. If you go to a theater and you get an inferior quality seat and you're paying box seat for it, you have every right to ask for a tuition break. Dion mentions Drexel University students filed a class action lawsuit. There are more and more of those as well. I would definitely keep an eye on that. William Marcelino asks about writing instruction. This is a great, great problem. Well, there's bad news and good news, William. One possibility is that if we continue to see enrollment decrease for the reasons I've articulated so far this morning, we may see student-teacher ratios decline. And if we don't change hiring patterns, then the writing classrooms may drop in size, which, of course, is great news for composition. So instead of writing classroom of 25, you may drop down to 15. But doing this online is interesting. We have all kinds of positive ways of teaching online. In fact, my first publication back in the early 90s was about teaching writing online. But there's also challenges of this. If we think about questions of privacy. I mean, you mentioned writing analytics. There are all kinds of fascinating ways to use that to improve writing, including using AI. But there's also the downside of, for example, people have a lot of criticism of turnitin.com for surveilling and making use of student data without compensation. So I have some hopes, especially when it comes to creativity. David, thank you very much for coming. I'd love to hear from you by email afterwards. And Maggie points out, I'm just going to read this to you because this is a great phrase. We are currently at this moment experiencing limitation of online education to type your question in the chat box during a lecture, therefore limiting the conversational capacity. How do you think we can overcome that, given the theory the pandemic will be with us until 2024? Well, thank you, Maggie, for the pandemic note. We're not anticipating a vaccine until next year or later. I mean, we've never made a vaccine for coronavirus. There's also, if we generate one, questions of how it can be produced and distributed and how long uptake takes, all of that. I think in many ways, Maggie, we have a body of practice and a body of research on how to maximize online learning. So, for example, actually using a chat box, not everyone will do this. What I'm doing now of actually reading the chat and ventriloquizing your comments and inviting you to be up on stage is not something that everybody does. And I think it's actually excellent. I think it's a way of getting feedback. So Maggie, for example, if you didn't have the bandwidth, the technical bandwidth to appear on video, well, chat is something you can do because it requires less throughput, and I can use that and bring that up. And we know that chat or any kind of back channel is a way to really expand the participation of students who feel awkward or uncomfortable as well. There's a whole body of literature about this dating back to the 1980s on how to do this. I think right now we may be in a good position to spend the summer learning from that tradition and improving our teaching online. Dion asks about the quality of online education, addressing the student refund issue. That's why I use the word perception here, Dion. I believe that online education and face-to-face education are so rich and diverse and have so much variety that, is one better than the other is like saying, is French instruction better than biology instruction? There's a whole range of good and bad. That's why I said perception. I'm really interested in the stories that we'll tell and will circulate. I'm looking hard at NPR and the New York Times because they have a lot of influence in higher education, as well as, of course, the Chronicle inside higher ed. And I'm really listening hard to student voices on this. I hope that we will fight hard to make our quality of education as excellent as we can, because I think that's our ethical responsibility as instructors. But also, I think it'll help, it can potentially help overcome those issues. Charles Wachira, forgive me if I mispronounced your last name, Charles, asked about privacy concerns and virtual learning. Yeah, this is a real issue. It's an issue with Zoom, although Zoom so far hasn't really been hurt in the marketplace. They've become enormous. But privacy concerns have led people to cut back their online presence For example, I mentioned the learning management system. That's one reason to use it and to corral your conversation inside of that. For example, if you're a professor teaching a class in Islamic history, you might want to publish those materials online for everyone to see because you think people need better materials in Islamic history. On the other hand, you could be afraid of being attacked by Islamophobic people, and so you want to put that in offline in some way, or not publish it at all. Similarly, with your class, you might want to have discussion held offline for privacy for that reason. A lot of people generally like to use Facebook for organization, for everything from strikes to picnics. It may be that we decide to try and encourage students to use it less often, for example. The privacy concerns are very, very deep. I recommend, if no one has had a chance to look into it, Shoshana Zuboff's book about data gathering that came out last year is really, really deep and extraordinary. Nathan, I'm reading all these great questions, but I would love to literally hear from people. Does anyone want to actually join us and talk out loud and prevent me from completely dominating the conversation?
Absolutely. You're welcome to unmute yourself and speak. Just please mute yourself when you're done.
Dr. Bryan, thank you. Alexander, thank you so much for outstanding presentation. I had a question. I think you missed mine, but I was really interested in your ideas about the future of laboratory-based research, for example, in the life sciences. So, for example, we need to set up the experiment, but I guess we could have a robot do it or monitor it for us.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'd be curious.
This is a great question. Amanda, is that your field? Are you in lab sciences?
Yes, I am.
Which science? What field?
I'm studying inflammation, mechanisms of inflammation, both using animal model and in vitro.
Oh, great. Man, I'm sure people all around ignored me and ask you questions now. But
Yes.
Oh, my God. I can't take NSAIDs, for example, so I'm kind of fascinated by this. Well, Amanda, this is a great, great question. And what we're seeing, so let me speak so far to what I've seen and then what I think could happen. So what I've seen so far is basically a huge retreat from lab practice. That, in many, many cases, people don't have access to materials and they don't have access to technology. They don't have access to everything from mass spectrometers to telescopes. This has been a big step backwards. And in fact, some people are talking about the possibility that research as a whole is being cut back, especially in the sciences. What we're doing instead is secondary research. If you're quarantined at home, well, you have access to all kinds of preprints, to all kinds of articles, to offprints, to scholarly books, depending on your field. And so you can do that. You dive into the secondary research. Pedagogically, I've seen people do something similar where, all right, we're not going to work, say, dissecting something today, but we'll talk about anatomical structures and we'll discuss that, or we'll talk about ethics and so on. And you think about for a few weeks, that's quite doable. But for a semester, this gets to be a real challenge. So looking ahead, what I've seen are a few things. One is the idea of trying to use automation, as you say, to be able to have all kinds of either telepresence or program devices. That's really a great field to explore. Again, it depends on the field. I mean, some things have been automated for a long time, like astronomy. Some things it becomes extremely difficult. You're thinking about, microsurgery, for example. There's also the idea of trying to reopen labs in a way that obeys social distancing. Now, this is very tricky since some lab work requires you to be handling stuff with other people. But there's some push for that. And I think you'll see more pushes for that this fall. On top of that, there's the idea of virtual labs. And it depends again on the field, but to what extent you can simulate something. And there are a lot of good examples of this. I think that's another way that we may proceed. Great question, Amanda. Great question. I'm sorry.
Thank you. So much of that is.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Who else has a question that wants to talk about it? And I can read more too, if you like.
Bryan, this is Ira. Thanks for the great the great talk. One question I had was about the catch-22 of that universities are dealing with, of trying to decide what technologies to recommend to instructors. And there's a lot of the best practices that people are talking about right now are to limit the range of options in order to make it easier to scale and to onboard people to those technologies. But as a result, you end up limiting the possibility of innovation to a certain extent, and experimentation. Could you talk about your thoughts on that particular dilemma?
I'll follow what I did with Amanda and mention what I've been seeing so far. I mean, again, this is, for me, a key part of futurist practice is starting with this whole reality thing. And then extend it forward a bit. And thank you again. This is a great question. What we're seeing is a real mix. On the one hand, we're seeing people push for more and more intensive technologies, more complicated technologies. That is, for doing more work with video, more work with animation, more work with augmented and virtual reality. I mean, sometimes it's something low end, like Google Cardboard. Sometimes it's something higher end, like Oculus. But in the idea there being that what's missing is presence, and we have technologies that are all about presence, and so we should emphasize that. So we've been seeing that, and we've also seen the opposite. We've seen often under the banner of equity, that is, that students may not have access to the hardware, and they may not have the infrastructure. Personally, for me, this is kind of grimly gratifying, because for 20 plus years, I've been fighting to address the digital divide, which is an intractable and deeply laid problem in American culture. And I couldn't get anybody interested until March. And now people are concerned about it, because depending on your institution, depending on your population, some % of your students won't have access to high-speed bandwidth or internet at all, much less they might not have the technologies. When I was talking before about mobile-first approaches, some students only have access to phones. Now, we've had a solution. We've had several solutions to this before the pandemic. One of the great heroes of our culture that gets no love at all is the public library. And people, depending on where they were geographically, were able to get to public libraries and get access to desktop computers and to be taught how to use them, which is tremendous, and to have bandwidth. I mean, it's just a great thing. For other people, they've been using commercial enterprises. People have been using McDonald's, they've been using Starbucks to get online. And of course, we can't do that now with social distancing. So this is a problem. And I've seen everything from people saying you should only teach asynchronously, because Zoom, et cetera, require too much bandwidth. I've seen community college presidents driving school buses loaded with equipment and a Wi-Fi hotspot to areas that have bad Wi-Fi. I've heard stories about tribal colleges where they've actually printed with paper materials and shipped them to students so students could write with them and ship them back 1975 style. I mean, so I'm seeing a whole range right now. And part of it is that when it comes to back-end technologies, we can centralize them very meticulously on campus. But when it comes to student-facing ones, we usually don't. It's kind of up to whichever instructor. So Amanda may be using one piece of software for her class, and to pick someone at random, Elizabeth Paya, hello, she may be using a different piece of software, and it's kind of up to them in a lot of ways. So it really is up to the instructor. I'm teaching a summer seminar at Georgetown this year, and I've got a wide range of technologies to choose from. So I think for most campuses now, we're in this kind of experimental phase where we're still throwing all kinds of stuff at the wall to see what sticks. It may be that by fall, Ira will have a kind of stable body of practice, or at least by departments or colleges or universities. But right now, we're in that kind of like early New Deal phase of trying everything that works. That's a great question. Great question. And thanks to Deborah Buckland. I hope I have your name right. By mentioning my first book on digital storytelling. Thank you. Thank you. Second edition of that is a lot of fun. And we had...
I have one question. and I am completely uninformed outsider to the depths of education. But are we hearing enough of student voices? They are a different generation.
We're not. We're not hearing enough. And the generation technology issue is very interesting. It's possible to overstate the differences of generations and their experience of education and their use of technology. Siva Vaidhanathan has a pretty persuasive argument that what we attribute to age is sometimes really an attribute of class. That is, if we say, oh, this person, these kids, they're all good with, shooting video and playing games, it may be they're wealthy and they've access to technology. But at the same time, all the data I've seen, especially from longitudinal studies, show that generally speaking, the older you are in the US, the less technology you use, the younger, the more, generally speaking. For example, there's a great project in Toronto this year. They're trying to redesign the city because they have a growing population of senior citizens who have cognitive and memory issues, who are walking and inhabiting the city. So there's questions of how do you design a city for that population? And there's some interesting things, like, for example, changing medians in roads to make them wider so that it's easier to cross streets because you have to process less data. But one of the key things was removing touchscreens, because for a lot of these folks, touchscreens are pretty new to them and pretty foreign, and replacing them with physical buttons and dials and switches because that's what they grew up with. So I think in many ways, that's a long-winded answer, or long-winded way of saying there are substantial differences, and I don't think we're paying enough attention to them. I would love to see more a role of students in governance, getting more student feedback in all kinds of ways. And I would also love to see both studies of students, done either simple polling to ethnographies, and done by students doing that kind of research. And thank you for asking. That's a great beard, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm conscious of time. I've got 10:15 in my clock. I'm raring to go for more, but Nathan, Ira, I don't want to get in the way of your schedule. Do we have time for one more question, or should we pause?
We can do one more question, and then we need to wrap up so people have time to take a little bit of a break before we go into the first breakout. So if there's anybody else who wants to ask a quick question.
I've got some from the chat I can bring up, but I would love to hear from one of you. Well, I'll grab one from Robert Arena, who has the best name I've seen in the past 5 minutes. And I have to read this because it's very thoughtful. You noted earlier that these shifts in population and culture are so fundamental that we lack the ability to really consider and process the impact of these changes. I believe the humanities provides us some of the critical tools needed to process these changes at a deeper level. How do we encourage students to understand the value of the humanities and helping develop these skills? It strikes home to me. I mean, as a humanist, I'm with you. I agree. It's a challenge. You saw my chart about the declining role of the humanities. One reason is the humanities have been lousy at outreach. The academic humanities. I mean, if you leave the academy, the humanities are doing great. People are obsessed with the golden age of television. They're making stories. There's a lot of art. But academic humanities is just less and less of a factor. I think one thing is for us to really embrace the public intellectual, which we haven't really done in the humanities. Another is to pitch our work at audiences more carefully. When Swaroop, and Swaroop, if it's Swaroop or Swaroop, please forgive me if I have the accent in the wrong syllable. When he talks about paying attention to our younger students, and this is one thing, is to think about ways to address ourselves to them more closely and more carefully. But I think also the humanities are pretty promiscuous in our focus, that we're able to draw on and rely upon everything from other disciplines. We happily ransack economics, anthropology, psychology, and we're also good at hybridizing. So I think in many ways, the trends I've been speaking of today, demographics, technology. I think the humanities have a lot to say about this if we actually say it and we actually make those moves. I mean, thinking about what automation does to the human psyche, it'd be great to have more and more humanists. I mean, folks like Sherry Turkle at MIT doing that kind of work. And think about it this way, last thought, and almost a metaphor. If you think about an 18-year-old that comes to campus, that kind of stereotype you mentioned before, and they've had this certain experience of technology, everything from peer-to-peer file sharing to copyright to virtual communities to virtual reality and gaming and so forth. I think of it almost as an unconscious experience. It's one that they haven't had the intellectual tools necessarily to think through. But when they come to campus, they can meet with someone in poli-sci who can help them think about what it means for Joe Biden to campaign online. They can meet with someone from sociology who can help them talk about what a social movement is when it's mediated online. They can meet with someone from psych who can talk about what is the human mind like when we learn online. Meet from someone in philosophy, so in media studies, someone in literature. I think in many ways, the humanities are a great lens through which to perceive the 21st century. So clearly, Robert and I need to have our own program. Thank you all for these fantastic questions. Someone asked for my email. Put it in the chat box. It's pretty easy, brian.alexander@gmail.com. You can find my blog at bryanalexander.org. I put in a link to the Project Muse version of Academia Next. So you can just scroll through and read it online, or you can make the publisher happy by grabbing a print book or an ebook version. And that addresses at greater length some of the points that people have made. Thank you all very much for your questions, and I'm looking forward to taking the rest of the symposium today.
Thanks, Brian. I'm really grateful for the terrific talk. You've given us so much food for thought, and I'm sure that you've provoked a lot of conversation. That conversation, by the way, can continue, everybody, in the Microsoft Teams for the symposium. Information on how to join that conversation is on the conference website, which you all have, or you probably wouldn't have found your way into this Zoom. You can also use that website for to see what sessions are coming up, to follow the Zoom links for each of those sessions to the presentations that you want to attend. Also, during the lunch break, there's the live the virtual poster session. You can view the posters now and examine what the presenters have put together, and then pop into their Zoom rooms during the lunch break to chat with them about it. Finally, Dr. Alexander and Executive Vice Provost Stephen Ganji will be doing the closing session Q&A, and you can submit a question for that Q&A through the form that's also available on the website. So I'm grateful for all of you for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.